Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's daily chess test, I have two complicated positions which I think if you manage to understand them, then your chess level is going to go up and hopefully you will understand them. They're, I think, both pretty instructive. Okay, without much talk, let's get into the first position. The instructions you can see on the board. As always, set the positions up over a real board. Time yourself. You have 15 minutes per position. Do not move the pieces and write your analysis down. In both of these positions, it's going to be more about understanding the position and about planning than about concrete variations. So don't try to look for forcing lines. Okay, the first position, pause the video. Good luck. See you in a minute. Okay, so this is Leko Mamedyarov from 2006. Mamedyarov was a very strong player back then, and Leko was probably at his peak, maybe a bit after his peak. And it's white to play here. Let's talk about the position first. Well, white has the two bishops, that's the first thing. White has only one very apparent weakness, which he can get rid of with c3, c4. That's the weakness on d5, if he wishes to do so. However, for the moment, it's not a weakness black could exploit in any way. So what white needs to do is white needs to try to find a way to get to black's weaknesses. What are black's weaknesses? Well, black's weaknesses are the a6 pawn, the b4 pawn, the c7 pawn, and the fact that he doesn't have the two bishops. So what white wants to do, white wants to utilize his bishop as best as possible and highlight black's weaknesses as best as possible. Now, this position is not white to play and win. With this plan, which I'm about to show you, white doesn't get a winning advantage, but he gets a practical advantage over his opponent, whose moves suddenly become much harder to find, and that's very important in practical play. Okay, so before I show you the solution, if you look at some normal moves, I'm biased because I've solved it, so it's very hard for me to find normal moves now. But if you find something, if you try something like bishop to d2 targeting one of the weaknesses, then a5, bishop to c4, fine, your bishop is good on c4, but the knight is very good on c5. b3 gets you nowhere. You probably have to play c3 to improve your other bishop as well. Now bc3, bishop c3. But the problem is that black simply plays bishop to f6 and neutralizes your two bishop advantage. Retreating would lose a pawn. Once this bishop gets traded off, you both share the b file. There are no more weaknesses in black's position. The knight is amazing, probably better than the bishop. So normal moves don't really work. The idea here is to fix black's weaknesses, make sure they remain weaknesses, and improve your bishop in a way that disables black from trading. So the solution is a5. And this in itself is not enough for you to understand what's going on, but in conjunction with this bishop, which now has a free way into c6, which does two things. Firstly, disrupts the defense of the a6 pawn. Secondly, disrupts the control of the e file, which is extremely important. Knowing that this knight is about to jump either here, here, or here, that means that the bishop is going to be controlling e8, meaning that the rook cannot get to e8. Another very important thing is that this maneuver now enables white to put pressure on the b4 pawn without black being able to play a5. So black played knight c5 in this position, which is normal, and Leko simply continued bishop a4. Now, you cannot take the bishop. If you take the bishop, you're inevitably going to lose one of the pawns. So knight takes, rook takes. You have to defend the b4 pawn. So rook b8, and now queen to d3, attacks the a6 pawn. So rook to b5, and now bishop to d2. And one of the pawns is dropping. There's no more logical defense to this. If you try bishop f6, I can simply play b3, and if you play bishop c3, I trade and win the pawn. So after bishop a4, it wasn't possible to take the bishop. So Mamedyarov played rook b8. bishop to c6, and now we can see this bishop in its perfect position. I mean, ideally you'd like to have a knight here, but you don't have a knight, so this is great. Bishop f6, and from this position on, it's still equal according to the engine. Maybe white is slightly better, but trying to find moves for black is pretty hard. Queen e2 played, preventing rook e8 once again, even an exchange sack. Bishop d4 played, seeking activity on the f2 pawn and on the b2 pawn in conjunction with queen f6. That's a very logical plan. So rook b1, defending, queen f6, and now rook to d1, attacking the bishop, h6 played, and queen to d2. And in this position, Mamedyarov blundered. He played rook to e8. The bishop cannot be taken because you're hanging mate, but he gave up the exchange, and this was simply no good. Now black is simply winning. It's game over. He played queen f4 and went on to win fairly quickly. There was one drawing variation here, and that's bishop to c3, and hopefully you understand this. If you take the bishop, then you lose either your rook or the queen. So queen e2 would have to be played, and then bishop back to d4, and basically repetition. White would have to think of some way to improve his position. So this is where I'm going to leave you. It's still equal according to the engine, but practically with black being unable to control the e-file, with the knight being stuck to the defense of the a6 pawn, and with a future possibility of something like c3, once c3 comes in, that's going to be tremendous, white is practically better. Okay, the second position is from a training game I played today, and I got a much better position. Then we got into an endgame which I wasn't that confident in, let me put it that way. I thought I was going to win easily. So, pause the video, think about the position, you're thinking of plans, not of concrete variations. See you in a minute. Good luck with this one. Okay, here I'd spent quite a bit of time because it's a critical position. White has several issues, and let's talk about the issues now, because if you don't understand what the problems are, you're not going to understand the position. The first problem is the h4 pawn, of course. The second problem is the d4 pawn, which if your knight moves, let's say you play knight somewhere, then black can do this and attack the pawn, or if your king moves, black can do this. So that's the problem. The third problem is this bishop coming around to h5, and then once your rook moves, the bishop drops back to g6 and puts pressure on the c2 pawn. So this rook and this bishop could be troublesome. So you need to find a way to defend the d4 pawn, to keep control over the h4 pawn, ideally, and most importantly, defend the c2 pawn in a way that doesn't disrupt your active plans. Okay, when I analyzed this position afterwards, I couldn't find anything better than what I did in the game, and I think I'm proud of what I did in the game. The engine actually plays a different move and a different plan, but then just gets into a drawn position, which I don't understand. It says my move and my plan is the second best. The engine plays rook g7 check, and after king to d6 plays rook h7. But, and this of course was my first candidate move, but after rook h1 and king to b2 and rook to h2, black is simply threatening rook to d2, so I couldn't find anything better than to go back. If you play h5, then rook d2, knight b1, and this is a massive trade. This just doesn't work. I mean, this pawn is too slow. I'm not going to queen my pawn. The king is very near the safe zone. There are no tricks with checks. This pawn is about to start trolling, so I really didn't like that plan. If you try king b2, then the black king approaches, a3, let's say defending this guy. I don't know how black makes progress. I don't think he does, but white is the one fighting for the win with an extra pawn. So I don't know, king f7, knight to d1 maybe. e5. If black manages to trade off pawns, that's not good. So in this position, he could have also played rook to d2, of course, but with e5, the pawn is double attacked. So I didn't really like this either. So here's the plan. And I did manage to win the game convincingly, and I thought this plan was very hard for my opponent to oppose. So here's what I want to do. Ideally, I want my knight on e5. Okay, so if I can get my knight on e5, that means that bishop g6 is not an option, which means that c2 is defended. Perfect. Also, if I can get my knight to e5, then the a7 pawn is loose, maybe I'm threatening knight f3, evicting the rook, etc., etc. More importantly, once I try to get my knight into e5, on its way to e5, it has many multi-purpose squares and many multi-purpose ideas. So the idea is, the plan is, I play knight b1, knight to d2. If needed, I can play knight to b3, defending my d4 pawn. If allowed, I can play knight f3, evicting the rook with tempo and then jumping into e5, also defending my h4 pawn. So this is really a good idea. Knight b1. My opponent played king f6. I played knight to d2, and my opponent played bishop to e8. And now, of course, he wants to do what I'd already mentioned: bishop h5, bishop h5, bishop g6, evicting my rook. So I need to do something about that. So in anticipation of that, I played rook f4 check. The king has to drop back somewhere, and now my plan is sort of halted, because if I play knight f3, he plays rook f2 and wins. If I play knight f1, I didn't really achieve anything. I don't need my knight on f1. It's just a stupid move. I don't want to do that. So since he went back with the king, I just played rook to g4. And now, once my rook is back on g4, I am threatening knight f3 and getting into e5. And basically, there's no way to prevent it. If he goes back to f6 now, I play knight f3. So he played bishop h5. And now this is the hard part you had to see. After achieving something like this, what do? Do you trade your h4 pawn or not? Do you keep defending? Well, if you keep defending with rook f4, then knight f3, bishop f3, rook h4, something like c3, it should be equal. So that's not an option. Also, once you get your rook to the f file, you no longer have an infiltration on the 7th rank. So the correct way to play, and I'd analyze this so I know, is rook to g7, king f6, rook a7, rook h4, and now knight to b3, and everything is defended. My d4 pawn is defended, my c2 pawn is defended because I can always play rook to c7, and basically what I have to do is put him in Zugzwang one way or the other, play knight back to d2 once he does this and double attacks the c2 pawn, and then I just win the b5 pawn. So he played bishop to g6, I played rook c7 in anticipation of rook h2, he played rook h2, I played rook c5, and now it's all over. King g5, I played knight to d2. There's nothing he can do to prevent me from taking this one, because I'm also threatening knight f3 check. So if, for example, bishop e8, then knight f3. So he played king f4, and now I simply took the pawn. If he attacks my knight for the second time, thinking that my knight has to move, and then he takes on c2, well, if king e3, then knight f1, and I win. So he played rook f2, which doesn't really do anything. I just went back to c5. He was threatening king e3. And after king e3, I just go knight b3, and now it's all over. And this is how the game ended. I just pushed my pawns, and here he resigned. So coming back to the starting position, I mean, you have some issues in the position, but you're better, and you need a way to improve your pieces. The knight on c3 is completely useless. This is the worst knight in the world. Of course, it seemed good to have a knight on c3 because it prevents e5, but he doesn't have to play e5, and I have no way to make progress if I don't reroute my knight. My rook is already optimal, my king is already optimal. So this plan, I thought, was instructive, and I'm happy I found it during the game. Okay, hopefully you did manage to solve both positions. Let me know what you think about them. Yeah, I hope you liked the test. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye, see you tomorrow.